It's 7 o'clock and we're beginning our webinar. First, we're going to wait for the attendees to come into the Zoom call. Lots of familiar names coming through. Making me think about how lucky we are to do this every year.
Oh, I have a problem. Wait. Can you guys still see me?
Yeah.
I can't see you. John? I have a problem.
Audrey, maybe you can hit your mute button while you're working on that.
Okay. I will. Where's the mute button? Oh my God, the sun, I can't see. That's why.
Hi, welcome to this evening's program, which is the start of the Thoreau Society's 82nd annual gathering. This year, we'll be discussing Thoreau and the politics of extinction. The annual gathering will take place in Concord from July 12th to July 16th. And we have special virtual events that begin this evening with our distinguished panelists. And then we have a post-conference webinar that we will have Link Johnson and Robert Saddlemeyer joining us, and that will take place on September 20th. So welcome everyone. The Thoreau Society, as you've heard me say many times, is the oldest and largest organization devoted to an American author. And we're very proud to have members in all 50 states and 20 countries around the world. We also have 56 volunteers that help the organization out throughout the year. And that includes Thoreau Society members who serve on our advisory committee for our two publications, the Thoreau Society Bulletin and the Concord Saunter. If you're new to the Society or you're not yet a member, I encourage you to join the Thoreau Society at thoreausociety.org. And I will be handing things over to Rochelle, but before I do that, I would like to remind everyone to use the chat feature to send us your questions. This session will go from the start until 8:15, and the last 15 minutes will be used for question and answers. So without further ado, I will move things over to Rochelle, the Thoreau Society's president.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's so wonderful to see you all here tonight, to see all these names. And we do encourage you to pop a hello into the chat if you haven't already, and let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. As Mike said, this is our launch event for our 82nd annual gathering, our conference that happens every year and brings together Thoreauvians from around the world to share ideas and spend time together, glorifying in the thoughts of Thoreau and exploring them and their applicability to our times. So our theme this year for our annual gathering is Thoreau and the Politics of Extinction. And this webinar kicks off a series of events. We have this webinar, as Mike said, we have the conference in Concord, July 12th through 16, and then we have our final event on September 20th at 7 p.m., also a Zoom event, so be sure to sign up for that. This panel is called On Vanishing Then and Now, a conversation on Thoreau and the politics of extinction. We're bringing you these three panelists because their work spoke so germanely and so insightfully to that theme. We know that you will be taken and moved by their thoughts as we were, as we considered their proposals. I'm going to introduce them very briefly and then turn the floor over to our first presenter. Each presenter will speak for about 20 minutes, and then, as Mike said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'll encourage you towards the end of presentations to throw your comments or questions into the chat, not the Q&A, the chat, if that's possible. So I'm just delighted to introduce our three panelists. Audrey Raden is an adjunct professor whenever necessary, she says, a poet, a writer of memoir, a fledgling novelist, a raconteur, a cat lover, and a transcendentalist to boot. She'll be our first presenter tonight. Our second presenter is Geoff Wisner. Geoff is the editor of Thoreau's Wildflowers and Thoreau's Animals, and he's a board member of the Thoreau Society. His next book, A Year of Birds, includes excerpts from Thoreau's journal with sketches and watercolors by Barry Van Dusen. It's going to be gorgeous. It'll be published next year by Mercer University Press. And then our third panelist is Robert Thorson, Thor, known to all of us. He's a professor of earth sciences at the University of Connecticut and a life member of the Thoreau Society. He also serves on its board, and he is the author of three related books known to so many of us: Walden's Shore, The Boatsman, and The Guide to Walden Pond. Audrey, I'll turn things over to you, but not without mentioning your wonderful book, which people really need to know about if they don't already. When it comes time to die,
when I came to die.
When I came to die, I should know the quotation inside and out. When I Came to Die, beautiful meditation on Thoreau and grieving. Audrey, thank you so much for being with us. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Rochelle. I really appreciate it. Also, my apologies to everybody for my little technological difficulty in the beginning, but it seems to have been resolved by my technologically minded husband. I am very honored to be on this panel. I am very grateful to Geoff because he directed me to his book, Thoreau's Animals, where I got a lot of the quotations that I use for passenger pigeons and fireflies. The paper is called Brute Neighbors and the Thoreauvian Imagination. I believe the central question of Walden, and perhaps all of Thoreau's work, occurs at the beginning of the chapter Brute Neighbors. Why do precisely these objects we behold make a world? Further down, he begins to answer his question when he says of the wild animals, they are all beasts of burden in a sense, made to carry a portion of our thoughts. To understand how in one paragraph objects evolve into creatures with agency, I want to examine what he means by brute neighbors. Brute didn't have our negative connotation in the antebellum period. A brute wasn't a bellicose or aggressive person, but simply meant fauna, the animal creation. Neighbor was more biblical for Thoreau than it is for us. When the prophets and Jesus recommended that we love our neighbors, they are not referring to the family that dwells in the nearest hut. Rather, the neighbors we are supposed to love are best described as kindred human beings, that is, all human beings. But Thoreau does Jesus one better by insisting on an equality of love between all beings. He says later in the chapter, you only need to sit long enough in some attractive spot in the woods that all its inhabitants may exhibit themselves to you, using the verb exhibit to give the most intimate of connections to being neighborly. Thoreauvian imagination, as far as I know, is my own term. My first exposure to Thoreau came in my mid-30s in an elective course in an MFA program, and reading him, along with Emerson, decided for me that I would pursue a PhD in transcendentalism. While I was doing my coursework, I became passionate about Thoreau's late nature essays. While I was doing my coursework, what I think by Thoreauvian imagination is the idea that seeing is perception, desiring is a path to one's own understanding, or reason, as the transcendentalists would have had it. The entree into this world was most apparent to me in a passage near the end of Autumnal Tints. The scarlet oak must, in a sense, be in your eye when you go forth. We cannot see anything until we are possessed with the idea of it, take it into our heads, and then we can hardly see anything else. Autumnal tints, I've recently learned, is not the first place Thoreau expresses this idea of perception. Of passenger pigeons, he writes on September 2nd, 1856, "One man's mind running on pigeons will sit in the midst of a village, many of whose inhabitants never see nor dream of a pigeon except in the pot. And he, looking out with expectation and faith from morning to night, will surely see them." I look with expectation and faith to see even those creatures who have passed from the earth. Since I discovered that my spiritual and intellectual heart belongs to the transcendentalist, I've felt a sad fascination with the birds Thoreau referred to as wild pigeons. The only photograph I've ever seen of one is a black and white shot of Martha, the last known living passenger pigeon who died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. The only renderings I had seen at that time were the Audubon prints, in which they were arranged, dead and pinned to boards, in very unbird-like poses. There was an exotic bird shop I passed in the early 2000s on 33rd Street as I walked from the subway to the grad center, called 33rd and Bird. Though I have always been opposed to keeping wild animals and birds as pets, I was nevertheless arrested by the huge plate glass window revealing a giant case of all varieties of tropical birds. They were brilliantly colored, with strange long tails and tall speckled crests. Yet it was their ordinariness rather than their strangeness that drew me to that window again and again. There they all were, scratching, pecking, bowing their heads jerkily with each step forward, and fluttering from perch to perch, just like the sparrows and chickadees I watched from my fire escape and bedroom window. One night, I dreamt I was standing in front of the bird store and the enclosure was full of passenger pigeons. They weren't two-dimensional and contorted like Audubon's, but were busy being birds, pecking, fluttering, scratching. They looked like somewhat larger mourning doves with longer necks, orange breasts, and deep blue wings. The next time I walked from the subway across 33rd Street, I discovered the metal gate pulled down and the sign removed. 33rd and Bird was gone. Wild pigeons went into sharp decline just in Thoreau's short lifetime. In his late completed essay, Walking, he writes the once plentiful birds have grown scarce. Yet earlier in his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, he writes in Tuesday, "The woods on the neighboring shore were alive with pigeons. We could hear the light, wiry, winnowing sounds of their wings and their gentle and tremulous cooing." This passage always breaks my heart. I have written elsewhere that in the same chapter, Thoreau describes the acrobatic frolic of two red squirrels through the trees as mirroring John and his youthful pleasure on the water. It is always shocking to read further on that they shoot their squirrel brothers and try unsuccessfully to cannibalize them. But they do succeed in eating the pigeon they shoot the same morning. At first, consuming one pigeon doesn't seem a form of twinning for two brothers. But in an earlier description, he says, you may frequently discover a single pair. Notice the juxtaposition of single and pair, sitting on the lower branches of the white pine in the depths of the wood, so silent and solitary, while the acorn which was gathered in the forests of Maine is still undigested in their crops. Like the one pigeon the brothers eat together, the two pigeons share one acorn, passing it to one another in their beaks, an intimate feeding, a communion of neighbors. As the pigeons began to fall out of the world in Thoreau's lifetime, so have fireflies fallen out of mine. He wrote in August 1854, "A few fireflies in the meadow. I am uncertain whether that so large and bright and high was a firefly or a shooting star. Shooting stars are but the fireflies of the firmament." When I was a child in a small town in Pennsylvania, summer nights were defined by fireflies, though we called them lightning bugs, as Henry occasionally did too. I would watch the other children torturing them, and my tears and pleadings only encouraged them to greater acts of cruelty. At the very least, they would put them in glass jars, poke air holes in the lids, and watch them starve to death. But even worse was when they ripped out their lights. The girls would stick them on their third fingers and call them engagement rings. I caught fireflies too, but just for the pleasure of letting them go. Gently, I'd cup each one, then spread my hands. A freed firefly would never fly away at once, but its legs brushing my palms like tiny feathers, it would make its methodical way to the tip of my index finger. Buzzing its wings like a Lilliputian hummingbird, it would lift off and hover. Just before it flew away, it would flash a golden acknowledgement. I would do this over and over until my mother hollered me inside for my bath. After Henry's bicentennial in 2017, my husband and I continued our journey north to visit friends on a farm in Maine. Late one night, one of them took us to a big field to see fireflies. "You don't see these in New York anymore," he said, and we waited for lights amid the mosquitoes. It was a muggy night and unusually hot for the coast of central Maine. Here and there in the distance, a single light would flash. "Must be the weather," our friend shrugged, and we went back inside. Thoreau says in Walden, "In any hour of the day or night, I have been anxious to improve the nick of time, to stand on the meeting of two eternities, the past and future, which is precisely the present moment. As I have argued before, for the present to be the meeting of two eternities, it can't really exist. It can only be anticipated or recreated. This recreation of any present moment calls for a Thoreauvian imagination. For example, those creatures who exhibited themselves in brute neighbors are as long dead as Henry Thoreau himself. In fact, some of them may have come from species that are now extinct or nearly so. But if we read about them, recreate Thoreau's experience in our imagination, do they then only exist in the past tense? Or as Thoreau puts it, if we look with expectation and faith, will we see them? I believe the imagination is an act of creation, thought transforming into action. Looked at from this angle, the woods along the two rivers are still alive with pigeons. A firefly is still winging off my small grubby finger. I don't mean to sound cavalier about extinction, which with its partners, climate change, war, and famine, is the great tragedy of our poor planet. But when a beloved person or pet or even a tree leaves us, when are they really dead? When in 2017, my oldest brother had to sell the house where I'd spent my adolescence, the flowering linden I planted in his yard in the early summer of 2009 to celebrate my coming through the most difficult time of my life was still flourishing, growing taller and taller, its multitude of branches spreading vigorously. "That tree is you," a dear friend told me. My brother dutifully kept tabs on my tree, crossing the street to check on it every time he visited our former neighbor. It was a thriving, healthy tree, but just before the pandemic, the new owners had it cut down. I felt at first that I'd been hacked down too, but as time passed, I began to realize that linden still existed. I am forever struggling to bring a tall sapling in a giant pot home on the bus from New York to Pennsylvania. The neighbor's son-in-law is forever crossing the street with a shovel to help me dig in the rocky soil. My brother and I are forever dumping stock pots of water at its base because the hose is busted. My beloved cat Selznick, who at the end of his 17 and a half years died quietly in my bed beside me in 2000, is with me every day. And when my father died in 2008, just a few days short of the 95th birthday party he was so looking forward to, I went to pieces. But now I entertain my students with his funny stories, and we laugh together. All three of them, father, cat, and tree, are absolutely present with me. But these are individuals I'm using as examples. What about entire species of plants and animals, or our last hunter-gatherer societies? Do our memories of them die with us? As they move off from us into non-existence, do they still carry our thoughts? I believe until the end of our finite species, we all together carry cultural memory, not so much the anthropological definition of books, monuments, and rituals, but as an intercultural memory that is a shared consciousness of all beings, all inanimate matter too. Across the thousands of millennia, we share with our neighbors, human, animal, and plant, as well as rocks, sand, and water, a sense of existing, which in natural time is the same as having always existed. There really is no end to imagination. Surely the imagination is able to outlive all the imaginers. I want to hope that all of us can keep the vanished ones present by living with them moment to moment. I want to believe with Henry, we can hardly see anything else. I want to see all the millions of generations filling the planet that is the human mind. If we really pay attention, won't the past be with us in the eternal present? Considering the state our planet is in, what else can we do but pay attention? Bring the past, as Emerson says, into the thousand-eyed present. The Thoreauvian imagination constructs the technically non-existent present. Just as, if we're lucky, birds and insects' wings can brush against our hands, can't they brush against our consciousness? As all the transcendentalists knew, time didn't have permission to exist unless it was granted by consciousness, which is, to me, the imagination. We imagine ourselves and our world into being. Of course, we can imagine wild pigeons and fireflies into our hearts, as well as others that have been driven away. To bring the past into the present might be our only solution to experience, with preciousness and joy, the ones who are still present. The first Europeans, the one whose descendants would create the United States, who came to this continent where tribal people had long sojourned, described the sky going black with flocks of passenger pigeons. With sad inevitability, we all know the skies will blacken again, this time for good. I will not attempt to explain this scientifically, but rather how I imagine it. Before the skies go black, they will first turn a living deep blue, or as Thoreau writes in 1859, a dry slate color like weather-stained wood, fit color for this aerial traveler. As unmeasurable time passes, the moving blue will darken to moving black. Then in the last rapidly fluttering firmament, golden meteors will flash farewell, and our imagination will move on. Thank you.
Audrey, that was so thought-provoking and so beautiful. Thank you
Thank
so very, very much. Our second presenter is Geoff Wisner. Geoff, I will turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have slides, so I just want to see if I can make those visible to everybody. Let me know if this is working for you and if you can hear me as well. Yep.
It's working and we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and especially with people I know and like, with Audrey and Thor and Mike and Rochelle. So that is a treat. I'm speaking about Thoreau and the passenger pigeon. As Rochelle mentioned, I'm the editor of Thoreau's Animals and Thoreau's Wildflowers. I was also pleased to be in the anthology Now Comes Good Sailing, which came out in 2021. And again, I'm working on a collection of Thoreau's writings on birds from the journal, to be called A Year of Birds, probably, which will have an appendix that collects all the references to passenger pigeons that I could find in the journal. So in 1852, Thoreau wrote in his journal, "On my way to Plymouth, looked at Audubon in the State House." He didn't mean, of course, that he looked at John James Audubon himself. He meant Birds of America, the enormous book of colored plates that Audubon began publishing in 1827. In 1833, the state of Massachusetts bought a set for $800, and in 1852, when Thoreau saw it, it was on display at the State House. Here's how the State House looked about 20 years before that. Thoreau studied Audubon's paintings of the passenger pigeon and the mourning dove, which he called the turtle dove. The pigeon, he wrote, is more red on the breast and more blue than the turtle dove. In addition to painting this famous image, Audubon wrote several pages about the passenger pigeon in his 5-volume work, Ornithological Biography, an account of the habits of the birds of the United States of America. This was published as a companion to Birds of America over the same years. Audubon wrote, "The passenger pigeon, or as it is usually named in America, the wild pigeon, moves with extreme rapidity, propelling itself by quickly repeated flaps of the wings, which it brings more or less near to the body, according to the degree of velocity which is required." He continued, "Their great power of flight enables them to survey and pass over an astonishing extent of country in a very short time. This is proved by facts well known. Thus, pigeons have been killed in the neighborhood of New York, with their crops full of rice, which they must have collected in the fields of Georgia and Carolina, these districts being the nearest in which they could possibly have procured a supply of that kind of food." In 1805, Audubon goes on, "I saw schooners loaded in bulk with pigeons caught up the Hudson River, coming into the wharf at New York, when the birds sold for a cent apiece. I know a man in Pennsylvania who caught and killed upwards of 500 dozens in a clap net in one day, sweeping sometimes 20 dozens or more at a single haul. In the month of March 1830, they were so abundant in the markets of New York that piles of them met the eye in every direction." But what did Thoreau know about the passenger pigeon and its history? On January 24, 1855, Thoreau quoted from William Wood's book, New England's Prospect, published in 1634. William Wood wrote, "Many of them, the pigeons, build amongst the pine trees 30 miles to the northeast of our plantations, joining nest to nest and tree to tree by their nests, so that the sun never sees the ground in that place, from whence the Indians fetch whole loads of them." Thoreau writes a number of times about the passenger pigeon in the journal. It can be easy to miss, however, because he almost never calls it a passenger pigeon. Usually he calls it a wild pigeon or just a pigeon. This is an early mention from March 21, 1840. "The wild goose is more a cosmopolite than we. He breaks his fast in Canada, takes a luncheon in the Susquehanna, and plumes himself for the night in a Louisiana bayou. The pigeon carries an acorn in his crop from the King of Holland's to Mason and Dixon's line." This image is a detail from a painting by Walton Ford that shows passenger pigeons feeding on acorns. Acorns and beech nuts were said to be their favorite food. I'm not quite sure what Thoreau meant about the pigeon eating an acorn at the King of Holland's. I'm guessing he was referring to an area in Penobscot Bay in Maine that the Dutch held for a while in the 1670s. The red area on the map shows where the pigeons mostly breeded, whereas they would travel much farther to the extent of the green borders. The earliest record I can find of Thoreau's personal experience of the passenger pigeon is the one that Audrey discussed earlier from a week on the Concord Merrimack rivers. Henry and John are at a large island about a mile above the mouth of the Sauhegan River in New Hampshire. You can see the island at the upper right of the map. My friend Deke is trying to participate in this event. To judge from Google, the island in the middle of the Merrimack River still looks pretty green and undeveloped. Thoreau writes, and this will be familiar, the woods on the neighboring shore were alive with pigeons, which were moving south, looking for mast, but now, like ourselves, spending their noon in the shade. We could hear the slight, wiry, winnowing sound of their wings as they changed their roosts from time to time, and their gentle and tremulous cooing. This art is by William Jardine from 1854. Thoreau continues, they sojourned with us during the noontide, greater travelers far than we. You may frequently discover a single pair sitting upon the lower branches of the white pine in the depths of the wood at this hour of the day, so silent and solitary, and with such a hermit-like appearance, as if they had never strayed beyond its skirts, while the acorn, which was gathered in the forests of Maine, is still undigested in their crops. So what did Thoreau and his brother John do after they watched the pigeons? Well, you already know, they ate one. We obtained one of these handsome birds, which lingered too long upon its perch, and plucked and broiled it here with some other game to be carried along for our supper. For beside the provisions which we carried with us, we depended mainly on the river and forest for our supply. It's a little surprising to see Thoreau eat a passenger pigeon because he usually wrote about it with much respect, as if it were an honored relic of history. On August 6, 1845, he wrote, I sit here at my window like a priest of Isis and observe the phenomena of 3,000 years ago, yet unimpaired. The tantivy of wild pigeons, an ancient race of birds, gives a voice to the air, flying by twos and threes athwart my view, or perching restless on the white pine boughs occasionally. That same year, July 16, 1845, he quotes the French-Canadian woodcutter Alec Terrien, who remarks on how easy it is to hunt pigeons. How thick the pigeons are, says the woodcutter. If working every day were not my trade, I could get all the meat I should want by hunting. Pigeons, woodchucks, rabbits, partridges. By George, I could get all I should want for a week in one day. But 7 years later, May 9th, 1852, Thoreau writes this, saw pigeons in the woods with their inquisitive necks and long tails, but few representatives of the great flocks that once broke down our forests. This is art by Alexander Francis Lydon from 1870. There are many references in the journal to pigeon places in Concord. By this, Thoreau means places where passenger pigeons were baited with acorns and trapped or perhaps shot, but most of these places had been long abandoned by his time. On November 9, 1850, he remembers that 25 years before, when he was a boy of 8 or so, he roasted apples and potatoes in an old pigeon place. He also mentions an old pigeon place by the Deep Cut. It's the railway cut near his house at Walden. The following year, September 12, 1851, he writes, saw a pigeon place on George Haywood's cleared lot, the 6 dead trees set up for the pigeons to alight on, and the brush house close by to conceal the man. I was rather startled to find such a thing going now in Concord. Haywood had a woodlot just to the east of Walden Pond. It's marked on this map by number 58, which would actually put it just over the border in Lincoln. Thoreau continues, this net and bed belongs to one Harrington of Weston, as I hear. Several men still take pigeons in Concord every year, by a method methinks extremely old, and which I seem to have seen pictured in some old books of fables or symbols, and yet few in Concord know exactly how it is done. This illustration shows several different methods of trapping passenger pigeons. It appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1881, when the pigeons were already mostly gone. Thoreau continues, and yet it is all done for money, and because the birds fetch a good price, just as the farmers raise corn and potatoes. I am always expecting that those engaged in such a pursuit will be somewhat less groveling and mercenary than the regular trader or farmer, but I fear that it is not so. Thoreau doesn't go into much detail about methods of trapping pigeons, but the traps are shown in some 19th century books. So here, he quotes or speaks of Elisha Dugan, a neighbor who saw 2 pigeons today. He writes, prated for them. They came near and then flew away. Prating is a kind of buzzing sound made by the lips, used to call the birds. This is another painting by Walton Ford. In 1945, Francis H. Allen, the main editor of the 1906 edition of Thoreau's journal, published a short piece in the journal Auk called Prating for Passenger Pigeons. This is actually the entire article right here. He quotes Thoreau on the subject and concludes, "The art is doubtless as completely extinct now as the passenger pigeon itself." Thoreau himself seemed to understand the word prating differently. September 12, 1854, he writes, "I scare pigeons from Hubbard's oaks beyond. How like the creaking of trees the slight sounds they make. Thus they are concealed. Not only the prating or quivet is like a sharp creak, but I heard a sound from them like a dull grating or cracking of bough on bough." Thoreau was a great observer and collector of the nests of birds and the eggs. He doesn't describe the nest of the passenger pigeon directly at this point, at any rate, but on April 22, 1856, he writes this, "By the path and in the sandy field beyond are many of those star-fingered puffballs. I think they must be those which are so white like pigeons' eggs in the fall, the thick leathery rind bursting into 8 to 11 segments, like those of a boy's batting ball, and curving back." This is a photo of an Earth star fungus taken by David George Haskell. This one has 8 petals or segments, as Thoreau described. By comparison, here are the shells of some passenger pigeon eggs preserved by the Maine State Museum. Toward the end of his life, Thoreau was surprised to discover a large oak woodland in Boxborough called Inches Wood. His last mention of the passenger pigeon in the journal refers to this. November 10, 1860. This wood is said to have been a great resort for pigeons. We saw one large pigeon place on the top of the mill where we first entered it. This wasn't the end for Thoreau and the passenger pigeon, though. In 1861, he traveled west for his health, and in June, he explored the lakes near Minneapolis, including Lake of the Isles. Here's how the lake looked in 1893, as the city was starting to grow around it. And here's how it looked in the opening credits of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I'm indebted to Corinne Smith, author of Westward I Go Free, for the information that this is the very same lake. Thoreau had seen several passenger pigeon nests in the area, and when he got to the Lake of the Isles, he saw a nestling. He writes, "By Lake of the Isles and scarlet or pin oak, 8 feet up, a pigeon nest like former but more stable. One young bird, 3-inch long, dirty, yellowish, and leaden, with pin feathers, great bill bare at base with a blackish tip. Old bird slipped to the ground, fluttering as if wounded 2 or 3 times as she went off amid these shrubs." The nestling may have looked something like this photo from the American Museum of Natural History. Thoreau died in 1862. 25 years later, in 1887, a 10-year-old boy was standing with his uncle on Sherman's Bridge in Wayland when a flock of 7 passenger pigeons flew overhead. According to Ludlow Griscom, writing in his book Birds Have Conquered, quote, "The event was indelibly fixed in his memory as Mr. Warren charged him to note the occasion, saying that it was probably the only chance of his life to see the bird alive." And this turned out to be true. Here's what the Sudbury River near Sherman's Bridge looks like today. The last living passenger pigeon in the world died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Her name was Martha. Her taxidermied body is on display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. In the years since then, many artists have tried to capture the spirit of the passenger pigeon. This picture is by Bruce Horsfall in 1914, the passenger pigeon's final year. This is a stylized silkscreen image by Charlie Harper, done as part of a series on birds for the Ford Motor Company in the 1950s. This one is called Distant Thunder. It's by Owen Grom, who published his book Birds of Wisconsin in 1963. This is Bert Moss from 1970. And this is by Debbie McIntyre. I wasn't able to find a date for it. And here's one of my favorites by Walton Ford. I showed a detail of it earlier. It's called Visitation, and it was created in 2004. In 2013, artist John Ruthven began work on a mural that would commemorate the 100th anniversary of the death of the last passenger pigeon. The finished work is on East 8th Street in Cincinnati. It shows Martha leading a flock of pigeons through the sky. These two works are by Claire Rosen. I had thought they were paintings at first, but they're actually photographs of Martha against different backgrounds, also done in 2014 for the centennial of Martha's death. This is Kent McKay from 2015. Work by Wanju Hulse from 2019. The 1870s were the decade when the passenger pigeon population dropped most dramatically. Yet long before that, Thoreau seemed to sense that they would someday be gone. The way he wrote about them was like the way he wrote about the Native American as a race of being that was passing from the world. He was wrong about the indigenous people, but he was right about the pigeon. We saw before how in September 1851, Thoreau wrote that he was rather startled to find such a thing going now in Concord. In the very next sentence, having framed the pigeons as a thing of the past, he further distances them by describing them as fabulous or mythical birds and as sculptures rather than living creatures. The pigeons on the tree looked like fabulous birds with their long tails and their pointed breasts. I could hardly believe they were alive and not some wooden birds used for decoys. They sat so still. And even when they moved their necks, I thought it was the effect of art. 8 years later, at Brooks's Pigeon Place, he describes the birds in very much the same way. There was a flock perched on his poles, and they sat so still and in such regular order there, being also the color of the wood, that I thought they were wooden figures at first. This wooden carving of a passenger pigeon was done by Gary Densler and exhibited at the Cincinnati Zoo in 2014. In a way, Thoreau had looked forward to a time when art like this and old photographs would be the only way we could be in the presence of this bird. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Very moving, so informative, and I can't believe the ways in which that just spoke to Audrey's words. That was amazing resonances. Thor, I turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Rochelle, especially for the earlier introduction. And thanks to Audrey and Geoff. I've got lots of ideas now to discuss and think about. And of course, thanks to the audience that's out there, because I don't know where you are, but you're from lots of different places. Normally, I especially when I'm not on Zoom, I just never read my talks. I always just do it extemporaneous. But I find that Zooms tracks me in a little bit, or at least focuses my energy so that I am going to read something for you, but not for my full 20 minutes and not nearly as meditatively as we've just heard from Audrey and Geoff. But what I would like to do is take a minute to comment on Geoff's talk. This isn't a discussion, it's just an observation that I make. And that is that when I saw the map of the range of the passenger pigeon, I saw it mostly as east-west. And yet in my mind, I always think of them as migrating north and south. And there was just a juxtaposition there in my head that I thought was fertile for the imagination. I'm sure there's a good explanation. And with respect to Audrey's comment about, are dead things really dead? Are dead people dead? Are extinct things really extinct? Or do we have the memories of them? How live are those? And it made me think about the coelacanth, that primitive lobe-finned fish that was found only in paleontology, i.e. as a memory, until we actually see it and you catch one, in person. So the memory pre-exists the reality with the coelacanth. And so I thought that was also a play on what you said. So with that, I'd like to just go into my takeaways. And I really have two takeaways that I'm going to give before my talk. And number one is, without getting hung up on definitions, I think we should acknowledge Thoreau's prophetic messaging about biodiversity losses, that they can help us grapple with the issues of today and sort of deal with and mitigate the current extinction. I think there's a really prophetic message that he has in much of his work. And the second takeaway for me is Thoreau is an optimist. He thinks that human genius can figure out a way of just about anything, and I'll be raising that point near the end of my talk. We're in a pickle, and I think he would count on human genius to get us out of the pickle. So now I'm going to start reading a text, and I'll try it right here. Maybe you'll be able to keep track of me. The call for proposals for this year's AG, Thoreau and the Politics of Extinction, invite our response to his journal entry of March 23rd, 1856, in which he laments the loss of nobler and wilder animals from his sojourning territory near Concord, Mass. Here's the quote in full. When I consider that the nobler animals have been exterminated here, the cougar, panther, lynx, wolverine, wolf, bear, moose, deer, the beaver, the turkey, etc., etc., I cannot but feel as if I lived in a tamed, etc., as it were, emasculated country. Would not the motions of those larger and wilder animals have been more significant still? Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature that I am conversant with? The whole civilized country is to some extent turned into a city, and I am that citizen whom I pity. On the one hand, this quotes a prophetic early warning sign for the wave of mass extinctions now taking place in Earth's new Anthropocene epoch, the so-called sixth extinction. On the other hand, the quote is also an uncharacteristic one-off. It's an overly negative response that was cherry-picked a century later to help energize the wilderness movement of the 1960s. Returning to the quote, consider these key words: nobler, exterminated, tamed, emasculated, larger, wilder, maimed, imperfect, civilized, city, pity. Note that Thoreau defines nobler animals as being larger and wilder, knowing that even nobler and wilder animals had formerly existed in prior geological epochs. From his deep readings in paleontology, he knew of the ancient extinct mammals, the mastodons and giant sloths of the fairly recent geological past, and of the enormous saurians, is what he called them, the dinosaurs, of the much earlier geologic past. Now, those are nobler animals. Though Thoreau did have negative emotions about the extermination, his neighbors did not. For them, the absence of predatory wolves killing their livestock or of deer eating their corn was considered good riddance. He laments living in a tamed and emasculated country, a maimed and imperfect nature. And he ends with self-loathing. The whole civilized country is to some extent turned into a city, and I am the citizen whom I pity. All of this is provoked from the loss of what he calls nobler animals. What Thoreau does not say is that most of his favorite animals and plants benefited from the local land conversion from forest to farm. For example, the plantation birds of Walden Woods and the so-called wild apples of wild fruits. The cutting down of trees, this arboreal haircut, sent waves of change through local ecologies, stream hydrologies, and landform changes. In the notable case of the passenger pigeon, the land conversion, when combined with overhunting, did cause actual extinction. as Geoff Wisner just shared with us. In most cases, however, the exterminations created open niches that allowed local new species to move in and flourish. For example, the 19th century extermination of white-tailed deer gave rise to a more diverse understory, which enhanced the distribution of wildflowers Thoreau kept track of in his journals. The subsequent 20th century return of the deer without their simultaneous return of their predators led to the high populations that are now decimating the understory, facilitating the spread of invasives, and confusing the phenological interpretations of climate change. And now a few facts. Extermination is not about time. It's about geography, place. In this case, the here of 19th century Southern New England. His list of exterminated animals that were only locally and temporarily killed off, whether for food or fur or for being pests or threats. None are extinct today. In fact, 5 of the 7, beaver, bear, deer, turkey, moose, cougar, have returned to Thoreau country to reoccupy their former ranges. In contrast, extinction is not about place, it's about geological time. Unless brought back by modern genomic engineering, extinct species are gone for good from everywhere on planet Earth. Being extinct is the default condition for geological time. The fossil record proves that complex organisms such as Thoreau's nobler animals typically last only a few million years or less. The nick of geological time, if you will. In our own genus of Homo, our species of Homo sapiens is the only one left standing. Half a dozen of our sister species have already gone extinct in the last 500,000 years, perhaps at our hands. Importantly, both extermination and extinction are based on negative evidence. Whether or not something is missing, like your lost car keys, depends on the rigor of your search. Consider the case of the supposedly extinct coelacanth. It was known only from paleontology until an unsuspecting fisherman caught one in the Southern Ocean. In my 2017 bicentennial book, The Boatman, I published a 6-page exegesis of Thoreau's lament, the call for the proposals this year, regarding the extermination of the nobler animals, which I condense briefly here. During his first January after publishing Walden in 1854, Thoreau began a reading program in New England history, starting with William Wood's New England Prospect. Comparing Wood's observations from the 1630s with his observations from the 1850s made Thoreau aware of the many changes in hydrology, ecology, and land cover in his area. 14 months later, on March 23, 1856, Thoreau returned to those notes into his lament, which ended with, "Primitive nature is the most interesting to me." In sequence, his winter reading of history begat then and now comparisons, which revealed losses, which led to grief, which descended into pity, which Thoreau turned inward on himself. In 1977, historian Donald Worcester featured this psychological downward spiral in his magnificent book, Nature's Economy. 6 years later, William Cronin used that same downward spiral to poignantly open his 1983 book, Changes in the Land, a landmark in environmental history. The title of Cronin's opening chapter, The View from Walden, seriously distorts the place, time, and environment of Thoreau's message. The actual place of Thoreau's lament was the 3rd floor attic of the family home on Main Street in a bustling market town. The actual time was 9 years after Thoreau left Walden Pond. The actual context was not a nutrient-poor Kettle Lake in a piney outback, but the rich alluvial river valley that Thoreau was helping to transform through his practice as a land surveyor. Thoreau's interest in primitive nature grew as it disappeared around him. He knew what it looked like, having experienced the emptiness of the deep Maine woods and the titanic sublimity of Katahdin. But his lifestyle choices make one thing perfectly clear. By the late 1840s, he had made a deliberate choice not to join some Western mineral finding expedition, not to live the life of a pioneer, and not to join an indigenous tribe. Instead, he chose to become what Lawrence Buell calls a ruralist, a Harvard-educated and genteelly subsidized devotee of nature whose sister Sophia was his most intimate collaborator in natural history pursuits, unquote. Thoreau sojourned in what Richard Judd calls the second nature landscape of settled New England, rather than the first nature of so-called wilderness. From 1850 onward, Thoreau lived deliberately by choosing to live in a family home run by his mother, with a meal on the table, a fire on the hearth, a piano in the parlor, and a kitten on his lap. His lament that the whole world had to some extent turned into a city came from Main Street, USA. Throughout his life, Henry sought the wild within the tamed landscape rather than the tamed within a wild one. His interest in primitive nature was not actual, but historical and academic. Not until 1856 did Thoreau resolve the tension between his inner yearning for primitive nature and his active role in helping to destroy it. When searching for native cranberries in a cool early autumn day, he found himself in a patch of ground in the far corner of Beckstow's swamp that was so worthless it had been left untouched by human hands, or so it seemed. There he experienced a religious conversion comparable to what struck him on the summit of Mount Katahdin, one that erased his previous lament and gave him great hope. Quote, I felt a shock, a thrill, an agreeable surprise in one instant, for no doubt all the possible inferences were drawn with a rush in my mind. Unquote. After that integrative rush, Thoreau's lamentation was gone for good. It is vain to dream of a wildness distant from ourselves, he wrote. There is none such. It's the bog in our brain and bowels, the primitive vigor of nature in us that inspires that dream. Wildness lives within our minds, not within our landscapes. 3 years later, in 1859, Thoreau finally understood that the wildness of nature, meaning those things beyond human control, was actually increasing in his disrupted, rapidly changing, industrializing landscape. For an analogy, he turned to the chicken-thieving hen hawk, any one of several large hawks like the red-shouldered or red-tailed hawks that were thriving thanks to the abundant food supply of chickens. That bird will not be poultry of yours, he wrote. Though willed or wild, it is not willful in its wildness. Unquote. True wildness, he now understood, is never intentional, not something we can conserve or control. It simply is. Quote, no hawk that soars or steals our poultry is wilder than genius, he wrote, meaning human genius. In wildness is the preservation of the world. This is arguably Thoreau's most famous quote, at least for bumper stickers. He felt the same about literature, writing, in literature, it is only the wild that attracts us. Dullness is another name for tameness. When seen in the context of his cranberry bog and hen hawk epiphanies, Thoreau's bumper sticker quote can be rendered, ingenious is the preservation of the world. I believe that his genius and those of my colleagues here are helping us to adapt and live sustainably in the coming decades. Make no mistake, I'm not sugarcoating the damage that we 8 billion humans have inflicted on ourselves and other species in the last 3 centuries. The passenger pigeon is a case in point. In this Anthropocene epoch, we've engineered a more comfortable material existence at the cost of human spiritual disengagement. In the process, we've given Earth's surface a planetary makeover that has blighted the non-human world in unprecedented, even unthinkable ways. Our climates are changing, and our rates of extinction are unprecedented in the known geological past. Though the application of our human genius, or through it, the first nature of indigenous peoples gave way to the second nature of Thoreau's world before giving rise to the third nature of the present moment, described by Elizabeth Colbert as, quote, the control of nature. More specifically, our attempt to control the things that went wrong when we attempted to control nature with too little understanding. Our third nature will require that human genius be applied not only to the technological fixes, but more importantly, to the philosophical and spiritual fixes we need in order to become, once again, part and parcel of nature. So, my fervent hope is that with or without the nobler animals of first nature, and with or without the opportunistic animals of second nature, Our coming third nature will be one where our species actually lives sustainably, and where the notion of liberty and justice for all applies not only beyond to everyone in our species, but to other species as well. So I'll end with a question that I hope will precipitate discussion, since I'm the third one. Who are we as one species among millions? Who are we as one species among millions to say what is noble on planet Earth and what is not? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thor. Thank you. Thank you for calling our attention to the difference between extirpation and extinction and regional extinction and utter extinction. I remain amazed. I'm going to ask Geoff and Audrey to turn on their mics and ask our audience to start posting their questions in our chat, because I'm sure there are good ones. But I remain amazed at the connections between your papers, the ways in which you're all asking us to think about the relationship between perception and human memory and what exists, and how the human mind holds on to what's been lost, longing for that, wanting that, wondering what that sort of world was in relation to the present world. But more than that, it seems like you're asking us collectively to think about how to imagine a world continuing that exists out of our memory, that isn't the world of our memory. I mean, the world we're creating is no longer the world of our memory or our past perception. So just really provocative thoughts there. So Heidi Lawrence has reported that her 6-year-old wants everyone to know that he says hi, and we say hello right back. And we're so glad you're here. Great. Okay, while questions come in, let me ask our panelists. I'm sure you have comments for each other or questions for each other, or we could take Thor at his word and answer this. Who are we? To one of bajillions, a powerful one, a damaging one, a horrific one, I might say, Thor. But who are we humans to declare what's noble? Where do you go with that, Audrey, Geoff?
I think we have no right to declare what's noble. I can't. Oh, what I'm thinking of is the movie Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy, when he's addressing the jury and he says horses are more beautiful and these animals are more. Anyway, I agree with Thor. I mean, who are we? What do we have? We have a form of communication. I'm not going to say a form of intelligence, but we have a form of communication that is different, very different from other species. And by species, I don't just mean animal species. And I think we shouldn't take for granted that human communication is any more important than any other species communication.
Geoff, do you have a response?
Well, the first thing I thought of when Thor posed that question was an essay by Joy Williams that I read years ago called "Save the Whales, Screw the Shrimp." And it seemed to kind of sum that up, that there's certain animals and plants that we value and identify with and want to save, and certain others that we're only interested in eating or grinding into fertilizer. And I'm not sure what to say about that. I would like to idealistically to believe that we not judge the worth of other creatures, but of course we do every day. I think at the very least we should strive not to let any more than necessary disappear forever from the planet.
Yeah, it seems like that's Keith in the comments has said, who will if we don't? In other words, if humans don't declare certain animals noble who will. And I think part of our challenge right now is, and part of what Audrey, I think you're saying, and Geoff, you too, if humans don't recognize that all creatures are noble, then it's far too easy for us to keep inflicting the damage that we're inflicting. I wonder, we've got a question here about dinosaurs. How much did Thoreau actually know about dinosaurs and prehistoric animals in general?
I can give a short answer. And dinosaurs were named by Richard Owen, I believe, in the mid 1840s. So right about the time he's going to Walden Pond. I don't remember that he ever used the word in his writings. He may have, and I might have missed it. But he did use the word saurians. He was definitely knew about dinosaurs because he could describe their bones, and he could describe them as leviathans and reptiles. And, I mean, he basically knew of them, but probably not by that name. And he knew they were huge. And he had read Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, by 1851. So he was very smitten with the descriptions of the megatherium and the giant ground sloths and the extinct horses and the mastodons. Of course, even Thomas Jefferson knew about mastodons. And Thoreau writes about mastodons and mammoths. So he's well aware of two of the mass extinctions that we now talk about, by virtue of their even nobler than noble animals, because they're bigger and older and scarier. And so he did. I think he knew quite a bit about, I don't think he knew a lot about dinosaurs, but I think he read a lot about the ancient extinct beasts, and he was well aware of the progressivism and the evolutionism that was in the air. I mean, I suspect that he read Robert Chambers' Vestiges, when he's at Walden, or right around that time when it created a stir all over the world. And dinosaurs were part of that.
That speaks to another question we have, which was how much did Thoreau, in his contemporaries, actually think about extinction? How much was extinction on the minds of Thoreau and his generation? And any of you can address that. Anyone who wants to.
I plan to address it, but I'm going to defer to Audrey and Geoff first.
Yeah, I don't have a quick answer to that, but related to the dinosaur question. I would just add that Thoreau writes about seeing fossils imprinted in the coal that he burned. And when he describes saurians, it's often in connection with ferns, which he seems to have recognized as a very ancient plant.
Well, I can sort of answer the question. I mean, Geoff and I both talked about passenger pigeons and wild pigeons, and Thoreau knew they were rapidly vanishing. And as Geoff pointed out, when he saw them, much less frequently, they looked like they weren't real anymore to him. And so, and then he, talked about, as Thor said, the nobler creatures that weren't there anymore. So I think he's very aware that there are animals that are disappearing from our lives all the time, even in Thoreau's day.
Yeah, whether he grasped the idea of complete extinction from the planet, though, I don't know. I can't think of an example.
Thor, I know you can speak to this.
Yeah, I don't know that he was explicit about that. I really think that he knew a lot about extinction. I think that he progressed time and expanded it so much that I think he would put the rise and fall of civilizations, and the rise and fall of clans, and the rise and fall of individual lives, and the rise and fall of geological epochs in the same continuum. And I think especially the time he's walking through the deep cut in the moonlight, and he talks about this dynasty is gone and another one is coming. I think he's very much into what we might call punctuated, but he's not fully embracing the progressivism of Louis Agassiz, where basically you extinct everything and then start over again and upgrade life. I mean, he was definitely not evolutionist, even at the time he was writing Walden, but he doesn't have a mechanism. And Thoreau gnashes his teeth because he doesn't have the Darwinian natural selection mechanism. But evolution as a phenomenon is very widespread in the community. And there's a lot of controversy going on between that and, Louis Agassiz's version of and the old biblical mode and the newer evolutionary mode without natural selection as a mechanism. But he was on it.
Isn't it true, Thor, that the work of Lyell and the work of Chambers had uncovered animals that no longer existed? So this was very much the current, right, in natural history, that people knew that there were animals that no longer existed. But the notion of anthropogenic extinction was sort of dawning on 19th century naturalists as they're living in that era. Right. I
completely agree. In fact, I would argue that the best evidence or smell, of the extinctions to come, are the acknowledgement and recognition that they had occurred in the past. I mean, extinction didn't exist until Cuvier found the mosasaur. And the idea is it's so big and it's so unusual, it's so weird and it's so different, like a 30-foot long swimming lizard. You got to say, we can't see this anywhere on the planet Earth. But if it was a mouse we were talking about, or a smaller pigeon, you could miss that, if it went extinct, but you wouldn't miss a mosasaur and you wouldn't miss a mammoth. And I think those are the kind of large bodied daylight things, that would really support extinction, even in Thoreau's day.
Thor, someone has asked you, could you type into the chat, please, Larry Buell's source on the comment you made about Henry's sister Sophia as his closest companion in nature writing? If you could type that in there for folks to see.
Well, I don't have it on hand with me right now.
Which book is that? Do you remember?
Oh, it was out of the Environmental Imagination.
Okay,
Yeah,
so the Environmental Imagination, 1999, I want to say, but the Environmental
95.
Imagination, 95, Lawrence Buell. Okay,
Something like
great.
that, yes. I mean, he's told with the idea that he calls him a ruralist, and then defines it.
Yeah.
And he sticks by it, and I'll stick by it too. I mean, what I've read about Thoreau, he had lots of choices to go elsewhere and do other things and pick the life he wanted. He did not want to live in wilderness.
Wonderful. We've got just a couple more minutes, so if there are any last questions, type them in. And as I'm giving folks a minute to do that, I want to pick up on a phrase that you used, Thor, and I want to ask Geoff and Audrey about it because it relates very much to their remarks. You said this captivating thing that paleontology can be seen as like a memory. Those weren't your words exactly, but that was really inspiring to me. And I started thinking about the relationship between the history of unearthing the past and memory. Geoff and Audrey, your remarks were very much about memory. Geoff tracing Thoreau's entire encounter with the passenger pigeon, and then by the end, he's building on his memories of the passenger pigeon. And Audrey, your whole talk was about memory, what we remember, what's alive. Do you want to comment at all on this idea of extinction, or this concept of extinction and memory, what it might mean for us to think about extinction in terms of human memory? It's really philosophical, I realize, but I think it's fascinating, thanks to Thor.
It's a difficult question to ask and not sound Pollyanna-ish, but I see the correlation between memory and imagination, and that's why memory is creating the past. And it might not be 100% accurate, but it is something. It makes a difference that the past continues to have meaning in the present, and hopefully in future presents, it will continue to have meaning.
Okay, I think I'll act like a politician and sort of veer toward a related question that I would rather answer. But a question that I kind of expected someone would ask is about the idea that perhaps we can, through cloning, through genetic manipulation, bring extinct species like the passenger pigeon back to life. And it appears as though that may technically be possible, but the question I would ask is whether that creature really is the creature that disappeared in the first place. I was asked to contribute to the second volume of What Would Henry Do, in which people think about what Thoreau would do in the present day if he were living today. And I realized I found it very difficult to think about a Thoreau who did live in the present day, who had today's technology, who didn't live in Concord. He would be someone different. And the passenger pigeon too, a single passenger pigeon or a flock of 7 is sort of a pathetic remnant of those incredible flocks that used to darken the skies. And those flocks depended on a certain habitat. You can look at all the terrible, reckless, kind of brutal slaughter and trapping of passenger pigeons, and I didn't want to get into that sometimes disgusting account. But maybe more important was the cutting down of the forest, the habitat that they depended on, because it seemed that you couldn't be a passenger pigeon unless you were a passenger pigeon in large numbers.
Exactly. Yeah, you know what? It makes me think of the idea of cloning a passenger pigeon. I just read in the news yesterday that Paul McCartney is going to use artificial intelligence to release one last Beatles song because he's using John Lennon's voice. That sounds to me almost as horrifying as cloning a passenger pigeon.
I would love to just bring up the word deep fake. To what extent is cloning the woolly mammoth a deep fake in modern times or not?
Mm-hmm.
And that's becomes a philosophical question rather than a technical question.
Bob Gross has asked a great question that, at least coming from my angle in American literature and natural history, has about a 6-day answer. But I would love to know your perspectives on this. How did the notion of the vanishing Indian play into the idea of extinction?
Well, it was always sort of romantically linked, the vanishing of the buffalo and the vanishing of what were then called the Indians. That's just a short answer because we don't have much time. But, and they were hunters. They were hunter-gatherers, but they're remembered as hunters. And what they hunted disappeared.
It's such a complicated history there too, because of the sort of justifications that accompanied that use of the word vanishing. Geoff, you look like you were going to say something.
I would just say that the sort of pernicious thing about the way Thoreau thought about the Indians was that sense of inevitability, that this was something that was destined to happen. Their historical era has passed and off they go into the shadows. And it's wrong, and it's very unhelpful when talking about people or animals.
But I will add to that. I think that Gross's question is right on, that if you're talking about and envisioning the vanishing of something, you're already halfway to extinction, and you're controlling that outcome just by thinking about it. And so I don't think it would be that different. I think it's a good question because I think thinking about species that way or thinking about indigenous peoples that way is comparable. And I think the record of antiquity, deep antiquity, is things come and things go. And there are dynasties and there are the rise and fall of this or that. And I think that's a more accurate way of looking at life than the just the continuous, and certainly not the steady state. Evolution is never a steady state. It's always punctuated and grasping. And let's never forget that origination is the opposite of extinction. If you can't have extinction, you won't have origination.
Right. While being extremely careful not to suggest that
Yes.
that the extreme violence conducted
Of course.
against Native American communities, was
Thank you
somehow
for remembering
part
that.
of nature, right? Yeah.
I was thinking pre-Cenozoic.
Yes, our geologist. Oh, thank you so much. Well, we are out of time. This has been absolutely wonderful and such good questions. I know we could have spent much more time on them, but I thank you all for being here, and we will continue this conversation in Concord. All three of our panelists here with us, Geoff, Audrey, and Thor, will be with us in Concord in July, at least for part of that meeting. So you'll have a chance to talk with them more about their work. And of course, are you all amenable to receiving emails about your work? Is that something that you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, and they're
For
all
sure.
very findable on the web. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Mike, for hosting, and appreciate all the comments in the chat. Have a great night, and we'll hope to see folks in Concord and on September 20th at our webinar that follows this one.
Thank you, everybody out there for listening.
Yeah, thank you all.
Beautiful presentations. Thank you.
Good night.